Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everybody to this Autodesk community conversation. Today we're taking a look at Dynamo and we have a session called Discovering a New Environment. We've got some very special guests. So please thank you everyone for joining. If we could just pop to the next slide, Jacob, and I'll do the intros. So this is an Autodesk community conversation. This is a program that we run from the Autodesk community team, and it's where we invite some amazing expert speakers from across both Autodesk and the Autodesk community to come together and share some amazing insight and knowledge to you guys on the session today. Next slide, please, Jacob. So this wouldn't be an Autodesk live event or a webinar without the standard safe harbor statement. So the presentation that you will be seeing today may contain some forward-thinking foresights around the technology, the software, performance. Please do not make any purchasing decisions on what you may see today or any of the content that you may view in the upcoming session. So next page, please. So before we begin, this session can be transcribed in various different languages. So go to the captions in the meeting and use your mute controls and then turn on captions to get different languages. We would love to see you interact as much as you can via the emojis and the reactions. This is a community conversation. We would love you guys to get involved as much as you can and participate, ask questions. So please feel free to raise your hand. Unmute yourself and you can jump in at any time. Both of the guys here today are very comfortable with being interrupted, I guess, and getting asked questions on what they're showing. Please use the chat window for any chats and comments to converse with yourselves for us and get together. And as I said, the session is being recorded. At the end of the session, we will render it and get it up and running and post it on our page. So next page, please. So I will just quickly introduce myself for those of you not aware. This is the first time I've sat in on one of the Dynamo community conversations. My name is Jonathan Hand. I'm based in the UK and I'm the AEC Industry Community Manager here at Autodesk. I'm very happy to say we've got some amazing people on the call today. I want to do a quick introduction and a hand over to Jacob and to John, who have kindly joined us today. So I will hand over to you, Jacob, to say a few words and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so Jacob Small, I'm an implementation consultant for Autodesk, now based out of Stockholm, Sweden, but originally from Boston area back in the US. I describe myself as a Dynamo form junkie because I am on there way too often to be healthy, as my fiance so often reminds me diligently, Jacob, it's time to go to bed. Let's stop answering forum questions. So, and fortunately today we've got a great guest, John Pierson. John, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my name is John Pierson. I am a Dynamo user, developer, make custom packages, so rhythm, monocle, things like that. I work for a company called Parallax Team based out of Dallas, Texas, and then I run a blog called Design Tech Unraveled, which used to be called 60-Second Revit. I also am on the forums all the time, not as much as Jacob, but he probably have seen me on there one way or another. So yeah, excited to be here.
Awesome. It's great to have you, John. So today's session, number 51, we broke the 50 mark on the last session. This is discovering a new environment, and this is all about getting going with IDEs. Yeah, it's been a really long series. So as always, sessions broken down in effectively a presentation. We're going to be pretty light on the presentation this week and focused a little bit more on the live demo stuff. After we get through the presentation, we're going to cue up the danger music, and John's going to be doing some great stuff in basically developing some custom nodes here. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then at the end, we'll have our question and answer session as always. So without further ado, John, I think this first slide and many of the slides actually effectively are going to be entirely you with a little bit of me peppered in here and there. So
for sure. Yeah, so I mean, feel free to chime in whenever you want, Jacob, and then anyone who has questions, feel free to chime in and ask them too, and we'll get to them. I always tell people at the beginning of these things, like, feel free to interrupt. If we get sidetracked and it's something useful, that's a success in my mind. So always feel free. This presentation is about coding nodes in C#, which is a scary thing. So I always like to show this. It's actually a video if you hit play, Jacob, that scrolls real fast. But this is my quote Dynamo journey. I started learning Dynamo in 2014. I actually opened it for the first time in 2013 and didn't think I could figure it out. And then I started making a custom package, learned Python, and started learning C# in 2017. From there, I started publishing custom nodes in Rhythm as C#, and then eventually making tools for Dynamo like Monocle and Revit plugins and all these things. So if I could do it, you could do it. That's kind of the point of that. Everyone starts from somewhere. I started from opening Dynamo when the nodes were yellow by default, 0.63. I put Mrs. Vasari on my, I still miss Vasari on my little tagline because that's where I first interacted with Dynamo. And when I opened it, it all turned red, and I was like, I'll never learn this. But you know, if you remain persistent, you can learn it for sure. You will never hear me say Dynamo's easy though. I won't say it's easy. It is doable. It's a new way of thinking. Next slide. So there's a few resources along the way that are super helpful that have helped me along the way as well. Thomas Mahone makes the BIMorph package. That package is awesome, and he taught a really great class on becoming a zero-touch node developer as well. So be sure to check that out. The links, Jacob just pasted them in the chat. There's some YouTube videos from Marcelo about zero-touch as well, and there's some templates, and then Rhythm's open source, Archilab's open source as well. Next slide. And kind of shameless plug, but I am working on a course for zero touch as well. I hope that's fine, everyone. But if you're interested, you can check out that link. The stuff we're showing today is from that course, some of it, but that course has like 20 something lessons that are video tutorials. It's not done yet, but it will be done soon. So if you are curious, you can go visit that if you'd like. But yeah, today's presentation will get you started. So one of the biggest things before starting to write code is you need to look at a few things of sharing your code or version controlling it. So there is a AU class that I taught back in 2018 on a thing called GitHub. Put it in the chat if you've heard of GitHub. If you've dealt with Dynamo at all, you probably have. But I learned the hard way you should use GitHub if you're writing code. I built Rhythm in C# entirely before AU 2017. I screwed something up and lost the entire code base. And then I was like, oh my gosh, I gotta learn what GitHub is. So then that's when it was on GitHub, and it enables version control. It's basically like your central model for our Revit users out there. You can sync with it, it syncs your code, and it has points in time that it saves it as well. So be sure to check out GitHub as well. This class or this presentation today, the code is on GitHub. Next slide. Cool. So today we're going to cover something called an IDE, kind of a scary term that you might not be familiar with. That stands for an integrated development environment. Essentially, it's a really cool text editor. That's the way I say it, but it lets you edit your source code. It is kind of a scary program. Today we'll be in Visual Studio Community, which is free, but there are a few others to choose from as well, and we'll mention those along the way. Visual Studio is kind of the one that has the most resources, easy for you to get started and all those things. And we'll actually go through and point out all the portions of the UI as well. Another question, I guess, for people on the call is who all's a Revit user? Maybe chime in. And we could share the PowerPoint after this, I think, as well for one of those questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead and go to the next slide. So there are some benefits of working within an IDE. So we'll see this live as well. But essentially you get code protection, code prediction, all these cool coloring of your code and all these things. It's all text-based. Dynamo's visual-based, but that's one of the benefits is you get all this structured stuff within your IDE. You can also reference packages and build code that already exists and all these great things. And any example for the Revit API is in C#, so you're able to copy and paste examples. If you're in Python, not so much. So that's kind of the downside to doing something in context in Dynamo. If you're in C#, there's a lot of resources out there for you. I'm going to go next. There are a few drawbacks as well. Jacob added all of these because he helps with support a lot for Dynamo users. So you need to compile your code. If you've downloaded a package like Rhythm or Archilab or BIMorph, there are DLLs in there that create code. So you do have to compile it into something. It's not just scripts within your Dynamo graph, Python scripts. So there is that kind of situation going on. DLLs, compiling them and bundling them is a pretty weird process. We'll break that down on the live demo today though. And it's a whole new software to learn. So opening up Visual Studio is an additional software that we weren't ready to learn, but if you're wanting to make nodes, you kind of got to get in there and learn it. I actually learned Visual Studio taking a coding boot camp in 2017 that taught us to make websites. I've never made a website with C#, but what it did was got my butt in the seat in Visual Studio coding in C#. So it did kind of help me out quite a bit as well. Next. We'll go over these pretty quick. Oh yeah, we already talked about the options. We'll go next. How we can just get right into the live demo. Next. These are here more for your reference. That way you have them after. I guess this one got copied twice. Go ahead and go next. And next. We'll break that down in the live demo too. So I guess we could talk about this real quick. I'll mention it when I'm in Visual Studio Live. But we can kind of relate these things to Revit terms. So when I teach these things, I'm a Revit user, so I tend to relate them to Revit user things. But we will relate them back like that as well. If you're an AutoCAD user, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to be able to relate it back to AutoCAD terms for you. So you need to wait till the next session.
Yeah, we'll have Zach doing another one of these next week.
Civil 3D.
Yeah. Cool.
So yeah. All right, next. Oh, cool. And this is what we're going to make. This code is on the sample GitHub repo. Next. And yeah, so this is going to be the code. So you can scan that and go to the GitHub if you want to view the code. We will go through it live on this call as well. So that's the other thing. So next.
I think the next after that is
live
demo.
All right,
yeah,
cool.
That's the end. I think I got the links all into the chat. If anybody missed one and wants them, like, hey, I think I missed something, just put it in the chat as we go. And I'm going to stop sharing now so John can take over.
So let's see, portion. Cool. All right, so we should see, my desktop. That's what it looks like to me as well. Cool. All right, and then I'll move this. I have the chat open, so I'm just going to move it out of my way. All right, so this is the first thing you see. So Visual Studio is free, like I said. So Visual Studio Community is what we're going to be using. So you can go to Visual Studio, just search it, Community, and you can download it very quickly. It is free, so if you're building Dynamo nodes, you're really good. It's not free if you're making over $1 million in annual revenue. You need to get the enterprise version or the professional version. But if you're making over $1 million making Dynamo nodes, I want to talk to you because holy smokes, I make no money making Dynamo nodes. So let me know what you're doing. But yeah, so you could go download Visual Studio and get it installed. It is kind of an intense process, but you essentially just click through and tell it you want to work in C# and you're good to go. We won't show that live because it is kind of a slow process. So what we'll do is I'll close this browser now. And once you get it installed, this is what you see. So you see Visual Studio 2022. That's the latest version with a lot of really great code prediction things. And it is kind of weird at first, but this is like that home screen in Revit once again. So what we want to do is we want to create a new project. And we get presented a whole lot of different things. Depending on how many buttons you clicked when you installed Visual Studio, this could change a bit. But essentially, we know that we are going to be working with C#. And in Dynamo, that's referred to as a class library. So if we search for class, it'll start to break that down a little more. You can also filter it by the language you're using. I'm filtering by C#. And there are a few options in here. So we do have class library that targets .NET Standard. But if I scroll down, we have class library that's for creating a C# class. There are differences between these. I tend to use this one. You can use the other one as well. That's for some of the newer frameworks though. So kind of a niche topic here, but Dynamo's transitioning to something called .NET 6. That's what that package up here is for. Down here is kind of what we've traditionally used in the past. That's what I'm going to use for this demo. What you need to do is you actually need to name your file. So I think I have in my source folder, my discovery a new environment. We're going to make a new one for today. So you don't always have to do this, but you need to pick a place for your code to live. So that's my area that I'm going to load my code, and this is going to be the name of my project. So we could name this something. In this case, in most cases for me, it's named Rhythm or something like that. So we could just name this like my new nodes or something. We'll just kind of keep it simple. The framework that we're going to use is just kind of what's in here. 4.8 is the latest. Revit 24 supports that. Dynamo supports that. And it's backwards compatible, generally speaking. So we can kind of leave that at default. You can start it with older ones, but if you are building towards a newer version of Revit, you will have to upgrade it. So another thing to keep in mind. Also, Visual Studio 2022 is not a requirement to make all these things. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Using older versions is completely fine. All right, so once we open it up, all these things kind of open up, and I have a wide monitor, so let me mount some properties and things here for everyone to see.
While John mounts the properties, quick note, Revit 2025 and much of the other Autodesk product line in 2025 will be changing to .NET either 6 or 8 or something, not 4. So plan on having to pivot a little bit if you're following this on the newest build of Revit in a year or so.
There you go. And if you're still using it in a year, very cool. That means not everything broke, so I'm happy. All right, so here we are in Visual Studio. On the left, we have our properties. So like properties palettes in Revit. When I click on things, it'll start to give me information about them. On the right is our Solution Explorer. That's kind of like our project browser in Revit. So, you have your views, your sheets, your schedules, your families, all that stuff. That's what this essentially is our project browser. So that's what we can think of this whole right side of my screen as. Within that, we have properties. These are things that are names of the DLLs you're going to compile and things like that. You almost never have to open this if you don't want to. Generally, I'll open them to version something. So if I build something today, I would end up naming it 2023.8.1. That's kind of how I version things. It's called calendar versioning. So calver. Today's not the first, but this is the first build I've made today. So that's kind of how Rhythm works and Monocle and all the packages that I make as well. What that does is it gives me like a seemingly endless amount of numbers to keep building. So if I mess something up, I can get to 8.60, so I can keep on building those. Rhythm's updated so much that calendar versioning just worked for me. So we'll just hit save on this. You do get the little asterisk that tells you you saved or haven't saved and all those things. In the middle of my screen, this is what is known as a class. So this is what starts to make all those nodes that we see in Dynamo. The overall class is kind of what the name of it is in the library. So if we launch Dynamo real quick to relate these one-to-one, let's do that. So the overall class is going to be what gives you this first menu item. So I'm using Rhythm as an example, but if I were to have a class called string, that would be my overall string class. So that's kind of how we can think of that. So let's, the little zoom green bar is like fighting with me a lot. So if we were to make this string, we can do that. So I can like say my string class maybe. So that's how you rename that section in the library. For Dynamo, and I'll show this live, it is kind of weird because we will see this class unless we change something. So I'll show how that works here in a minute. For any node that you want to appear in the library, you need something called a public constructor. So all these nodes come from something publicly available in the DLL. The way that you do that is you're actually able to do public static, and then what you want to return. With prediction in Visual Studio, you will start to see that a lot of these things predict for you, and sometimes it is right. In this case, it's not right now. So what we'll do is my first node. This is going to be the name of the node, and then I'm going to leave that in an error state for now. We'll put an open parenthesis. This gives us inputs in Dynamo, and then we'll do curly braces, which is like the inner workings of the node. If I hover, you will see that I have an error on here. So Visual Studio is really good about giving you the errors pretty quickly. In Python and Dynamo, you kind of have to debug a little more difficult than this. C# has some of those benefits, but it is what is known as strongly typed as well, and we'll see that in a moment. It's telling me I need a return type. So any method, that's what this is called, needs to know what it's going to return. In this case, I'm working with strings or text. So what I'll do is string, and now it's a little bit happier. I only have one error. It's telling me that I need to return something. So in C#, if I do return, that color's pink, and now I have an error down here. So I've moved that error down to the bottom of my node at this point. What I can do is I can just return a string. So if you're familiar with Dynamo, you have to type quotes to get strings. It's the same way in Visual Studio. So we're just going to do return my string. And in C#, we need to end every line with a semicolon. So that's kind of that big thing, is it will tell me that I am missing an end of field character, which is a semicolon. So always read all the little warnings you get and everything as well. So that's kind of where that comes from. So I mean, as of right now, we have a node that will work in Dynamo. A good practice is to rename your file itself over here, once again in our project browser, to reflect what it is. So now we have my string class. That's not going to be underlined anymore because I renamed it, and we're good to go. So in this case, we need to compile this just to be able to see it in Dynamo. So in Visual Studio, we have a whole lot of menu items. We have a build panel here, and this lets us build our solution. So if I click on build and I go to output, we can actually see that I have a new DLL compiled, which is pretty cool, right? Everyone kind of following, hopefully. So we do have our DLLs coming out, and that's the location that it's in. So what I'm going to do, just to make this a little easier, is copy that to my clipboard, and we'll paste to go to it. See, I have a new DLL in here. This PDB file is a debug file. We can ignore that. And right now we are in the debug folder as well. So what we'll do is we see that we have a node in here. It has the version that I assigned and all those good things. So in Dynamo for testing, like really quick testing, there's an easy way to do this. This little plus sign down here, you can actually reference DLLs directly within Dynamo. So if we go ahead and click on that and I paste my path and hit enter, it takes me and shows me that DLL, right? Good to go. If I click on open, we will see that I have a new item in my library. If I expand it, I do have my string class, and then I have my first node. If we place the first node, we will see that it's already outputting a string. So very quickly, we've already made a node in Dynamo that just does an output of an item. There are no inputs, and there's just an output. That return keyword is what gave us an output. So we can see return my string. That's exactly what we get in Dynamo, is that string. However, we do get this other thing in here. This is a constructor. So what this is doing is building our class by default to show it in the library as a node, which is less than ideal. So what we can actually do is modify this. So back in Visual Studio, if we hit enter here on line 10, we can do private my string class and just kind of close it out. So what this does is tells Dynamo, we don't want anyone to be able to load this. The other thing in the Visual Studio is the indentation matters quite a bit as well. If it gets messed up like it is now, do Control A and then Control KD on your keyboard, and it fixes all your formatting. So that's another hotkey to know. Control KD on your selection. So now that's going to hide that node that I got in Dynamo as well. We are going to have to recompile it. So on those slides, we didn't mention recompiling, and I'll show you an error that you'll get right now. So if I do rebuild, it's going to keep on giving me an error that says could not copy. This is part of the joys of combining these things into DLLs. Dynamo actually owns that thing right now because it's loading it. So Dynamo has ownership of that DLL that I'm trying to write to. So I need to tell Dynamo to get lost. And then I can go back and try to rebuild, and it says succeeded. So now Dynamo let go of that DLL, and I could rebuild it. Once we open Dynamo again, we can actually start to see that node disappear. Before I do that, let's go ahead and add a few other things to this. So who wants to add inputs? Also, feel free to chime in. So in order to get inputs in your nodes, that's going to happen on these parentheses right here. So this little parenthesis is where we start to add inputs to the nodes. So in this case, I can type in string. If I want a user to be able to enter a string. If I want them to input a number, I can put int. I can put double. I can put Boolean if I want someone to put true or false into my node. We can put Revit elements in there if we reference the Revit API. I'm not referencing it yet, but we'll go with string for now. And we'll just put user message, I guess. Probably sounds fun. Maybe we'll put username for now. Cool. So now I have an input. It's kind of a lighter blue right now in Visual Studio because it's not used yet. So it's saying you're not using this, use it to do something. So in this case, we can actually build a user message with that. So within the curly braces, so this one and this one, when I click on them, they both turn blue. We can start to build some things to return to our user. So I'll do string once again. Actually, let's not do string. We'll do var. Let's get into that for real quick. Var is a way just to define a variable that lets the compiler handle it. So given what you put in, it's going to return that. So what we'll do is we'll do user message equals, and it's starting to predict some things for me. In this case, string builder is not what I want. So what I'm going to do is quotes for a string, and I'm going to do hello space plus username. And see this prediction happening? This is where the power in Visual Studio is. I hit tab and it just fills that in for me. I don't have to type all that. I actually suck at typing, like a lot. I type like this. So for Visual Studio to help me out, it's always really nice. And now what we can do is we aren't using this quite yet. We will get an error that says you're not using this. It's being assigned and you're still not using it. We can actually return that at the end of our node as well. So let's go ahead and build this. And then I'll show a few things of some live debugging as well. I'll open up Dynamo 2.18, which already referenced my DLL, and it will load it as soon as Dynamo loads. Who loves how slow Dynamo loads nowadays?
Not
Nobody? Okay, good. So now what we'll do is we'll do new, and we will see that we have my new nodes, my string class, but we don't have that blank class anymore. Also, in newer versions of Dynamo, you can zoom in the library if you roll your mouse wheel with control held down. So that way everyone can see this. If I place this node, we now have a shiny new input, which is pretty cool, and we have an output. In Dynamo, this is a function right now because it's not doing anything. With Visual Studio 2022, there is a really cool feature introduced to where we can debug these things live. So what we can do is go to debug on our menus and attach this to Dynamo now. So in this case, I'll find Dynamo in my list and I'll attach it. So part of the power of Visual Studio as well is the debugging environment. If you click in the margin, you can actually start to add what are called breakpoints and start to see how all this works. Before we do that, let's just check out how that node works real quick. So in my case, I'll double click for a code block. Once again, quotes for a string, and I'll just put John because, you know, that's my name. Plug that in, and we'll see hello, John. We'll put Jacob, and this node will execute on the fly, which is pretty cool. Yay, so now it's saying hello to Jacob.
Hey, Dynamo.
If we add that breakpoint and I change the node, so I'll change it to Jonathan. I think I'm spelling this right. Yeah. Visual Studio is like, whoa, we got to this part of the code. Let's see what all's going on. So this lets you start to see how it's working while you're in Dynamo. So live debugging is super possible with Visual Studio 2022. Now you can see this little continue. If I hit continue, Dynamo finishes and we're good to go. What's really cool about this debugging thing is when you're building nodes like this, if I wanted to change this completely, I can. So if I come in and start editing my code, and then we'll do another plus. If I hit this little fire icon, it will reload that into Dynamo and I can rebuild it. Sometimes if you change too much, you have to rebuild and apply changes, so it will restart Dynamo. So let's go ahead and do that as well. We'll leave that, we'll save it. Everyone saves stuff on their desktop as like 5As because I always do. Cool. So in order to debug this a little more efficiently too, let's go to our properties within our solution. So on the right side of my screen, kind of, you know, like I said, like your project browser in Revit, we have all these different settings for our Visual Studio code. If we go to build, we can change things and copy things around and all sorts of crazy stuff. But we have debug in here as well. For Dynamo, if I browse, I can actually open Dynamo Sandbox on the fly, and it will load that graph for me. I think I was in 2.18.1. Is that what's pinned here? As you can see, I have a lot of Dynamo versions, and it confuses me. I'm in 2.18.0, so that's good. So yeah, you gotta make sure you know what version you're in. Cool. So now we have Dynamo tied to my debug mode. We'll hit save, so save often. Once again, make sure you use GitHub if you can. And what we'll do is now we have this little start button. So if we go ahead and hit on start, it compiles my code. That DLL is getting loaded into Dynamo. I think Dynamo still owns my DLL, so that's fun. So it'll compile that code and then, oh, let's build it. Dynamo stayed open longer than I wanted it to. Awesome. Showing this stuff live is good because we can start to see all that as well. Dynamo still owns my darn DLL, which is awesome. Yeah, Dynamo's still open, even though I closed it. Go away, Dynamo. So that's the other thing, is always know if it closed or not. There we go. So now it's building the DLL. Dynamo's reopening, grabbing that DLL, and showing that node to us. So that's what's happening at this point. So 2.18.0, loading all the nodes, and we're going to be loaded here. Launch Dynamo. Dynamo launch, new, and then we still have our nodes in the library. So we do my string class, my first node. I'll go ahead and type in John again. Now we're hitting that breakpoint once again that I have, and I can see that my user message that I'm forming is my new one. If I'm going to hit continue, we will kind of see how that works. Live debug's kind of finicky. It depends on what you have loaded, but you should be able to change some of these things and hit the little fire. Yeah, so now we can hit the fire and it's changing on the fly. So Visual Studio 2022 does let you do that, which is pretty nice. You can also do that in Revit. Revit's even a little more finicky than Dynamo, if you can believe it. So yeah, that's your first node that you're building in Dynamo Live. Additionally, within C#, we have a lot of really cool methods to handle these things, to combine these in a more efficient manner. A lot of times you will get predictions that tell you that you can do something different. So it's telling me that I can use a explicit type. So it wants me to say, oh, this is a string, so I can do that. It will change it, and it should still load. Okay, good. Like I said, that's a hit or miss. You can also start to add some variables. So it's really good at how it starts to do these things within C# or Visual Studio. This method that I'm using, this is very Dynamo-y, to where I just keep hitting the plus sign to generate things. So if I go into Dynamo and I were to do like hello plus username for an input, and I hit equals, of course, plus username for an input, we will get an input, you know, all those good things. So that's kind of how you do it in Dynamo. You need to add a space, which kind of stinks, all those good things. In C#, it actually prompts you to do this better. So if we kind of scroll down, it tells us we can introduce parameters, all these things, but it also tells you to convert it to something called an interpolated string. These are so cool, and I learned about these in the last few years, but if I click on that, essentially if you add a $sign, you can do curly braces to replace parts of text, which is really cool. So it's, hello, how are you doing today, username? And now that's still going to work that same way. So if I hit the little fire icon to recompile it, it's still going to fire off that same way. Other things that you have access to, because you are like working in a Windows environment. So if I were to want to get the username by default, so that we can type in some of these little prediction things. So environment, it starts to predict it as well. So environment.username is something that we have in here available to us in Windows. So if I were to type in var user, I'm getting the username from the environment now. Another fun one is user domain. And while you're debugging, the prediction sometimes doesn't work. User domain name, so it did work. So I can do user domain. Then I'll just put curly brace user domain. Sometimes, like I said, it doesn't work so good when you're debugging live. Now if I click it, it's going to tell me how you're doing today. And I'm on the parallax domain because that's what this machine is. So yeah, you can start to extract that information pretty quickly. The other cool thing with the string interpolation is that's what this little $sign thing is called, is you can keep adding to it while compiling. So if I do 2 curly braces and I do date time, which is another class within C#, I can actually just get the date time right now, recompile it, and we should be able to get that. And that's today's date and time where I'm at. So pretty neat. The good thing with C# is Dynamo is very oriented in that way. So if I type in date time in here, all of these methods are named like their C# variants. One of the quotes that I really like was from years ago now from Brian Ringley. He said, Dynamo is C# like masquerading as visual programming. That's because all these methods have C# underlying them. Dynamo is open source, so you can go see all these things as well. But that date time now is pretty much exactly what I typed in C#. I'm not saying that always works, it's not always going to be a one-to-one, but for the most part, they're pretty closely related, which is pretty cool. There's also a date time today. I guess like just try it live. We can do date time today. Let's see if that works. And it did because it let me compile it. Now when I click it, it's telling me today, which is pretty cool. So all this stuff, there's a lot of great tutorials out there as well. So if you're ever wanting to do something in C#, you can always search it as well. So if I were to just go to a web browser and type in C# lowercase string, my browser, hopefully, if it cooperates, pretty quickly you're going to find what you want. So string to lower. So if you click on this, it takes you to Microsoft's website and it's like, here's how you make a string lower. So let's see. S to upper, S to lower. So that's kind of how you do that. So if I wanted this to return as to lower, I hit dot to lower. It does need those little braces. It's happy once again. We refresh it, it's all going to be lowercase, which is pretty cool. So that's the other great thing, is you can find a lot of resources out there for you to use. As you can see, if I hover on this node or look at it in the library right now, it doesn't have any kind of description. It's just blank, which kind of is lousy, right? We can actually change that. I will have to stop running it to do this though. So in Visual Studio, if you go to Properties once again, we can go to Build, and we can tell it to make a documentation file. If I click on that, it will send an XML out. All of the packages that you know and love have this that are C# based. So if we go to %appdata, we can go to Dynamo, go to Dynamo Core, we're in 218, packages, rhythm. You will see that we have XMLs in here. That's what gives the nodes their descriptions. It's really useful to add to your nodes if you're building nodes for consumption by the general public. Now I have some little squiggly lines. It's telling me I'm missing comments. It's going to tell you you're missing one for the overall one that we hit anyway, which is super annoying. But if you just kind of let it, let's see. That's a different prediction than I've seen. So let's see. Oh, we can suppress it. That's kind of cool. Oh, so we'll suppress that one. For this one, if we hit 3 slashes, it does give us a summary of the node. So this is my first node. The username parameter didn't have a name, so we can actually tell people input your username. And if we want to tell what it's returning, we can do that as well. We just have to copy the same syntax. So name equals user message and my cool new message. And now if we hit start, we will start to see these things in the Dynamo library as well. So once again, debugging, opening Dynamo. If you do this for Revit, you're going to really go crazy because you got to open Revit and Dynamo. So like people see me joke a lot of the time about building packages for Dynamo and Revit, that it's kind of crazy. It is kind of crazy. So always bear with your package authors too if they haven't updated to the latest and they're working on it. So what we'll do is we'll go to my new nodes string, and we'll see if I hover, this is my first node. If I hover on my inputs, I should input your username, my cool new message. So we put in John. We now have that node that works with documentation. Always document the stuff you're doing, and that's one way to do it, which is really nice. So that's kind of how that works. If you're wanting to work in Revit, that's the other kind of thing that we have to think about a lot of the time. So we can look at referencing some stuff here to wrap this up a bit. Once again, the next session with Zach's going to cover actually building things, referencing APIs, but I'm going to get into it a little. So references are like our links in Revit. So these are all of our references to the APIs we want to use. By default, Visual Studio comes with a few that you're going to use, but we can add more. You can right click on it and add a reference and add that from your machine. This is an easy way to do it. An even easier way to reference things is something called nugget. So nugget's this really kind of weird concept, but these are packages kind of like Dynamo's package manager. As you can see, there's a whole lot of different things in here to choose from. If you type in Dynamo Visual, you will see all of the NuGets supplied by the Dynamo team. So we have like our Dynamo services to make Dynamo do things. We have the core libraries of Dynamo in here. We have our zero touch library. That's what we're building right now, our zero touch nodes. So if you want to use Dynamo's geometry, you can by referencing this. WPF are the UI things in Dynamo, so you can reference that as well. A monocle, for instance, references these three for sure. Rhythm references these two. So it just depends on what you're doing as well. A question for starting with zero touch nodes: is it recommended to use Dynamo Sandbox for testing instead of Dynamo in Revit or Civil 3D? The answer is it depends what you're building. If your goal is to build new things in the Revit API, you are going to have to use it in Revit. There's no way to load a Revit library in Dynamo Sandbox. Rhythm is unique because I split Rhythm Core and Rhythm Revit out. So I have string nodes in Rhythm that work in all versions of Dynamo, but the Revit one will not load in Core. So if you were to open Dynamo Core, for instance, with that Rhythm Revit, which does all the Revit nodes, it just won't load, and I'll show you where you see that in a second. Come on.
Yeah, I do
AutoCAD
recommend.
might differ.
AutoCAD doesn't differ from that way. It is still an in process, but I do recommend if you've got a use for stuff that does not involve Civil 3D, Revit, AutoCAD, etc., build a core version the way John did. It will make your life so much easier. My first experience doing zero touch nodes was similar, where it was like, oh, I just want to manipulate a point, a Dynamo point, and I'm having to spin up Revit every 6 seconds. So yeah.
Yeah. So if it's just Dynamo stuff, yeah, Dynamo Sandbox. But if you're making like one of my first nodes I made was like pinning an element in Revit. I couldn't make that in Sandbox. And as you can see on our little console here, you can see that Rhythm Revit didn't load. So if I was trying to build Revit nodes, I'm already kind of hit a brick wall there. Fun fact, if you build a Revit package in Dynamo that's zero touch and you reference a newer Revit API like Revit 24, you're going to probably get the same freaking user message on Revit 20 if you try to load that package. So when you see us on the forums kind of chiming in a lot that like packages aren't updated or something, Revit's APIs changed a lot in the last few years, so it's caused a whole lot of headaches for package authors. Rhythm should load in 21 to 24, but it's still a wild ride, so I'm still trying to figure out how to handle that. This is a comment from John only, but there's not a whole lot of support from the team for package authors, unfortunately, so it's definitely in the community's hands. So it's one of those things to keep in mind if you want to build a package for Revit or Civil or something. So I'll close this once again. And yeah, so that's kind of how Rhythm loads, is I have two Visual Studio solutions that actually load two different sets of libraries. In order to install these though, let's say I wanted to install the zero touch library, you can pick your version of Dynamo that you're using. So generally you'll target the version that you're working in the most. In this case, the sample library is in 2.18.0. So I'll just hit install, and we will see that we have a few new references show up. Another note for the team is the Dynamo icon always shows up for whatever freaking reason. So if I hit yes to all, I get the Dynamo logo even though I didn't ask for it. So yeah, you get that along with the DLLs. You can just delete it though. That way it's not bothering you. So we'll just delete that now. The other ones that we can load are the core libraries if we want to access geometry. I think zero touch access is geometry. So back in my class now, if I were to type in like line, it should start to find some of the things for us. So Visual Studio 2022 is really good at this, but it helps you reference libraries that you need. So in this case, it's saying, do you need the geometry line? And I'm like, yeah, I do. So it told me to put that in. I can do line as a variable name equals, and my auto predict should start to reference some of the ways to create a line. That might be the wrong reference. Let's see. Yeah, so we will need to add those usings. So if I were to reference line, once again, let's go back and we hover, it gives us a lot of ideas here. So I do want to use this using. I did this one by accident. So I want to reference a library that's within this DLL right here. Using statements appear at the top of your Visual Studio, your classes. And what these are these like, so in Revit, you link like a Revit model, and then you have instances of that Revit model placed around. These are the instances of those things that you're diving into of these DLLs that you referenced. So if I click on Show Potential Fixes and click on Using, it does add that here to the top for me. You used to have to type these manually, so like getting started in C# and Visual Studio is super confusing because you're like, what do I need to reference? It's gotten better over the years, and a tool that's paid that you can use that helps with this a lot as well is called ReSharper. I use it all the time. It's like the best tool because it takes care of a lot of this for you and adds more prediction. I turned it off for this demo though, so I'm kind of struggling without my tool at the same time, but yeah. So now if we were to do line equals line dot by, it's not predicting correctly. Am I still debugging? Yeah, it's not going to predict correctly. Oh no. Point equal. It's weird that I'm not getting the right predict. I might not have referenced all libraries. So let's go back to our NuGet packages and reference core as well. And I bet that one's it. We get to go there. Yeah, the usings definitely get confusing. Point. Yeah, my auto predict is acting very weird. Okay, we're gonna leave that alone for right now, and I might open Rhythm and show it. But you should add your references and be good to go from that point of view. Yeah, I don't know why my auto predict like turned off on me. The other thing that we want to cover, so referencing your NuGet packages, if you want to reference Revit things, there are a few ways to do that as well. So for any of our Revit users watching, if you type in Dynamo Visual, there isn't anything in here from the Dynamo team for Revit libraries, so you do need to reference those manually. I actually have a version of a NuGet package I published that have the Revit libraries referenced, so you can use that. I only have it up to 2.16 though, just because I haven't updated it. But you can reference that one through NuGet, or you go to right click and add reference. So for Dynamo Revit libraries, since Revit 2021, I think, those are going to be in your C program files, Autodesk, Revit, we'll go to Revit 24, add-ins, Dynamo 4 Revit, Revit, Dynamo Revit DS, and all these. So you'll want Revit nodes and Revit services. So if you add that reference, we'll click OK. We will see that reference show up here in our library. So yeah, we have Revit nodes and Revit services. So now we can start to access things from Revit. So if we do Revit.elements, element, it's going to tell me I need to reference that namespace. So I can say introduce local. So now we have our Revit elements. So these are kind of what give you the green element IDs in Dynamo. Once again, this one's kind of a getting started setting up your project, so I don't know that we'll go into full depth into those. That'll be the next session, it sounds like. So yeah. To think of if you're a Civil 3D user, same solution as for Revit. Yeah, so Jacob answered that. Generally though, this same stuff, you can compile all this code to be used in all variants of Dynamo, for Revit, for Civil 3D, for Alias, if you're one of those users, for all those good things. Dynamo for Alias is an interesting world, for sure. So that's how you add references manually. You can also add references to Revit API. So you have all of our different Revit APIs in here. But the easiest way to deal with Revit API It's actually just to come into the NuGet packages and search for Revit API, and you'll have a whole bunch of them. The one I really like to use is this all main versions one. And when you install this, it actually just gives you access to the Revit API now. So now we have Revit API UI, Revit API, and all those good things. So now we're starting to work with the Revit API. In the follow-up for this, on the comments on this community conversation page, I'll include a link to my AU class as well. That's building Revit add-ins, so that way you can reference it. But yeah, if we were to type into using autodesk.revit.db, we are now going to start messing with the Revit API if you wanted. So we can do wall, and that's a wall with an Autodesk Revit. So you can like create a wall or whatever.
So John, there's a
Kinda weird that
question
my
from
prediction.
Chris in the chat. Do you have to reference the Dynamo Revit files or the direct Revit DLLs like a full add-on might be?
That's an excellent question. So yeah, you do have to reference both. So the reason being is in Revit, our namespace, these are namespaces. It's autodesk.revit.db. In Dynamo, it's revit.elements, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
If you've ever used a package like Orchid, he returns types that are like database documents. So does Rhythm as well. If you want the green element ID, you have to return it within the Revit elements namespace. So you do need to reference both. You need to reference the revit.elements one, which are the Revit nodes and Revit services right here. So I'll circle those in this pink color. That gives you the green element IDs and lets you translate between the ones you can click in Dynamo. And you also have to reference the API, which tells you I want to work with Revit. So that's all your methods and all those things that you find on API docs. So if you were to go to apidocs.com or .co, in order to start to play with any of this stuff, you do have to reference the Revit API. And we do have the add-in course linked. So that one does help you get started with the Revit API as well if building nodes for the Revit API is your goal. Like I said, Rhythm is fully open source, so kind of next steps are to go dissect some of that code. I always include things in a source folder, so SRC. If we look at Rhythm Revit, let's say I want to see how that crazy dude John did the dimension nodes that he has. You can go to dimension, and now we have a method right here. That one's kind of a big one. Let's go to a smaller one. We have a method right here, so public static. You know how to recognize that now. We know that it has an input, right? That input's of the Revit elements class. Can I zoom in? Yeah. Whoa, too much. Okay. So that input's of the Revit elements dimension class, so a green clickable element ID of dimension. And we loop through it and get the overrides within it. So that's kind of how that works, is now you know that you're looking at a method, you're looking at the inputs, and you're looking at what I'm returning. In this case, I'm returning a Boolean, so a single thing, not a list, and it's true. So with those kind of essentials of knowing what a method is, inputs and outputs, documentation, you can start to look at some of these and maybe make some sense of them as well. You can also see all my usings here at the top. So all the using statements of what I'm using to make these things happen is there at the top as well. Rhythm, Archilab, fully open source. You can download them and take a look at these things and see how people are doing them. If you use NuGet packages, when someone downloads your Visual Studio solution and they hit build, it will restore those packages from the cloud. If you reference them locally, it won't. So that's the other benefit of using NuGet packages. A good question. Yeah, so I think that covers what I wanted to cover. I guess kind of to tie it all up, we imported the DLL directly. That's not going to help you if you want to ship this to people. I know that the next session will get into that quite a bit more. But generally, I just publish these things to get my whole package structure. So if I click on new on this workspace once it opens and go to packages, publish a new package, I can give it a name. So my first nodes, and I can tell it to add that DLL for me to use. So I think I have it in my paste cache. Yep. Windows V is how you get like a paste history on Windows for anyone who wants to know. Kind of cool. I'll click on my new nodes.dll. I'm going to tell it it's a node library, and then I'm going to publish it locally. So that's how you get that package structure that we looked at a few times with Rhythm. So all of this stuff, you can generate this stuff in code or manually, I just use Dynamo to do it, and it bundles it for me. So those nodes would show up. I can publish this package to the package manager already if I wanted, and all those good things. So you can now make a node that does some string stuff if you really wanted and publish it to the package manager. Kind of cool. Like I said, all this code is on GitHub, but yeah. I think I'll stop sharing probably because to show the other slides.
Sure thing.
And if anyone has questions, feel free to reach out too. Like I said, I have a full class coming out on this. I plan on pitching this to AU next year as well and all those good things. But yeah, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, so with the last of the time here, I'm going to check, of course, as soon as I start screen sharing, I lose the chat. There we are. Any other questions? I don't see anything in the chat, so I guess we can progress. So next session in 2 weeks, we're going to have another sort of coding for Dynamo and Zero Touch session with Zachary Jensen. It's focusing more on the Civil 3D side of things. So I know, Patrick, you had a bunch of Civil 3D questions. So it's going to hopefully get a bunch of those things answered pretty quick in the next session, and then expand stuff a little bit further. And then we're going to continue down this route. On the 31st of August, we're going to do Teaming Up the Team with special guest Michael Kirshner from the Dynamo development team, who's going to talk about basically doing our first ever pull request of Dynamo, making Dynamo better as a team. So we'll have a good set of insights from an actual Dynamo team member in terms of what makes a good PR, which will be really good. Then we've got one more session kind of in the planned series here, extending your Dynamo with special guest as of yet to be determined. We're going to talk about view extensions and Dynamo extensions and how to make it easier to make Dynamo graphs themselves, which is going to be a lot of fun. All right, Jonathan.
Thank you very much, guys. That was amazing. Special thanks to John for doing it all live. Thanks to everyone. Just wanted to just close out the session by just giving a few things that we have in the community. Don't forget, we've got the community forums, we've got loads of groups, we've got the community voices blog. We're going to check it out. You'll see lots of different content from loads of amazing authors. We've got the blog, the group hub, and as Jacob has just been showing, we've got loads more conversations happening on the Dynamo side. Don't forget, we're all over the usual social channels, so Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn. So don't forget to join and subscribe there. I think that should be the last slide, Jacob, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So a final word for me before I hand over to the two amazing guests. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this community conversation. Don't forget to check out the next one again, and I'll just pass over to Jacob and John for their final thanks and words.
Big shout out to John for hosting this and debugging live on the fly in a way I did not even know was possible. So always great to learn something from a master like this. So thanks a lot, John.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was a fun one, and yeah, it was one of those things I've actually never shown a lot of this live, so it was a good run too.